service, I'd like to invite you to join me in prayer so we can start our service today. Please join me in prayer. Our dearest Heavenly Parents, our true parents of heaven, earth, and humankind, our Lord Jesus Christ, good morning. In this beautiful, rainy Sunday morning, we're gathered here together as brothers and sisters in fellowship after this week of many lessons, joy, and also new things that happen in this week. We come together here in your home to listen to the words that you have prepared for us today. May you, through the speaker of today, inspire us and give us elements of life so we can continue on our lives, honoring you and making you proud in everything that we do. We thank you, Heavenly Parents, for all the blessings. We thank you for all the lessons and for all the challenges that we can overcome and learn with it. And we invite you and our Good Spirit world to be here with us here in our church center, and also with our brothers and sisters joining online in our Sunday service today. And I want to offer this prayer to start our Sunday service in all of our names, and in the name of Mien Vittorio Nobo della Corte, a Central Blessed Family, Adju. Hello, without any further ado, I'd like to invite you all to welcome our speaker of today, our national leader, Eli. Please welcome him with a warm round of applause. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Thank you. I wanted to actually start with a couple Bible readings, so apologies for grabbing them off of my phone here. We'll start with, this is Genesis 6, So when human beings began to increase in numbers on the earth, that's the first part I'm trying to get. Yes. So this is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. Then there's a long description of how to build it. I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you. And you will enter the ark, you and your sons, and your wife and your sons' wives with you. And then the description of bringing all the animals into the ark. And then Matthew 7:13. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. And continuing, but small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So that's Matthew 7:13 and 7:14. So first of all, I want to say, I'm always very happy to see everyone here today when I stand up here. It's really comforting for me to know that there are people sharing the journey and the faith with me, that it's not something I have to do on my own, right? It's always great to see and to have time to spend together with other people, knowing that we're kind of sharing, not the exact faith. I think everyone has their own understanding, their own interpretation, but the general direction and the general faith that we share and believe in. And it's very tied in to my topic today, which is about loneliness on God's path. And the reason I wanted to kind of share that Bible quote about Noah is because I find Noah's story to really be an example of one of the more lonely of God's providential figures. And one thing, before we kind of jump into the story of Noah, one thing a theory I have about the early parts of the Bible, because the numbers are so large, right? Noah was 500 years old when he had kids and 600 years old when the floods came. and he built an ark for 120 years. Adam lived to 900 years. So my own personal theory is that these are months and not years. A little bit of a miscalculation on whoever was writing the Bible back in the time. So, because then it makes a lot more sense, right? Then if Noah started building the ark 120 years before, that would be 480 months. That would be, he was 40 years old, right? A very interesting coincidence if you think about it. 40 years old, he's asked to build the ark. He started having kids around 42, maybe a bit late, but not too late if you're in a world where God says everything was evil and everyone was evil. So probably for a long time, Noah had to isolate himself from the type of society that existed there. And so, yeah, you see that Noah is asked by God to really do something, as far as anyone can tell, is insane, which is to spend all his time building a boat on the top of a mountain, right? And you have to remember that it's not just that everyone thought he was a bit crazy, but the way God describes the world at the time is that this was an incredibly evil world, meaning it was a very dangerous world. It means people were stealing from each other, taking from each other for no reason, just because they felt like it, probably constantly at war, constantly people kind of taking advantage of each other. So you had a very kind of unique, let's say, social environment where Noah had to somehow provide for his family, somehow survive. At the same time, in this society, start building this ark on top of a mountain, right? So not only was it kind of a great, crazy thing, but it was probably also a very dangerous thing to be drawing attention to yourself, right? So the real question, the really big question is, as Noah's trying to do God's will, he's taking this on faith, he's following God's instructions for him. Did his family support him in this, right? And it's a very kind of interesting question, and the Bible doesn't say for sure, but it's very unlikely that he had the full support of his family, right? And in fact, what Reverend Moon has said pretty clearly is that he didn't have the support, especially of his wife. His wife was actually one of the people that was, let's say, most critical of his work. So that kind of gives a very interesting context then to the story of Noah, because not only is he trying to do something that's incredibly difficult, while he's trying to raise a family, while he's trying, at that time he's having his children, and his children are growing up in this world. But it's a very difficult task if you had support. But if you don't have support, it then starts to sound like an impossible task, right? So one thing I always wonder about the story of Noah is how he felt when the rains finally started coming, right? Did he have this attitude like, was he vindictive, right? He had been validated, it was true. So when he looked out and he saw the floods coming and his family came into the ark, was he kind of vindictive about it? Was he a bit like, ha, I told you guys, you deserve what's coming? And again, a lot of this is speculation. Of course, the actual story of Noah in the Bible is very short. It's kind of 2 chapters, right? But if we understand human nature, we understand our own nature, right? It would be very hard not to have that kind of reaction, not to be like, ha, you guys made fun of me, but I was right all along. But I do believe, because the Bible describes Noah as a righteous man, as a good man, I would hope and I believe that he didn't have that reaction, right? That his actual reaction was one of sorrow and sadness for the fate of the world, the fate of mankind and the other people there. So the reason I give the example of Noah is, again, Noah was asked to do something basically all on his own, right? And even if he did have the support of his wife, it would have been an incredibly difficult task in the world he was in, the society he was in. But without the support of his wife, it makes it 10 times more lonely, 10 times more difficult. And we find that for a lot of the historical figures in the Bible, there's always this phase where they're really kind of very much alone in trying to follow God's will, because it's very difficult to follow God's will. If you think about Jacob, when he ran away from home, he was kind of in some ways completely on his own, right? He was kind of going to relatives' house, but he was running away from a brother that wanted to kill him. He didn't know, he was kind of running into something he didn't know. When he did get there, he was kind of it wasn't quite slavery, but indentured servitude to try to kind of build some kind of life for himself with his uncle. So it was a very lonely path in that sense, right? If you think about Abraham making the sacrifices, kind of all day out on his own, trying to, offer these sacrifices to God. Joseph's a very clear example, right? Thrown by his brothers into slavery, put into prison, right? Many times when trying to follow God's will, you're put in these situations where you don't have support and you're on your own. And then, of course, kind of the prime example being Jesus himself, right? And one of the saddest quotes in the Bible is when Jesus' family is coming to get him, right? And no one knows this, but the Bible explains that Jesus' family is like, oh, our brother's gone crazy. We got to kind of take him out and kind of lock him up at home, right? That was kind of the implication. And so he's speaking to a group of people and they say, hey, your family's here. And Jesus' response to that was, birds have nests and foxes have holes, but I have nowhere to lay my head, right? It's kind of, and that was in response to finding out his family was there to visit him. Of course, I suspect he realized what they were coming for, right? Not to support him, not to be there to support his mission, but to try to actually actively take him away from his mission. So that quote I read in Matthew, right? Broad is the gate to destruction, right? But narrow is the path to God, is kind of the reality for people that are trying to do God's will, that are trying to find God, is that it's a very difficult request. It's a very difficult thing to ask of people. And so most people kind of don't want to go down that road, right? So it can be a very lonely road at times. And I think, this is reflective of the fact that God is a lonely God, right? And so because God is also trying to follow a certain path, a certain set of rules and ideals that he established at the time of creation. And he can't force anyone to follow them. So he's waiting, right? And he's kind of working and actively asking people to come with him on this path. So God is a very lonely God as well, right? And so I think the reality is if we try to follow God, if we try to really understand God, we have to understand, in a sense, this type of loneliness, this kind of loneliness where we go on this path. And I do want to make a point now, because when people think of the word loneliness, they can also, it's often tied maybe with depression, right? Or with kind of this, and I mean a very different type of loneliness, because loneliness that leads to depression is in many ways, let's say, a more passive loneliness, where you kind of feel like no one knows you. You kind of feel like you can't trust anyone. You feel very much abandoned. And it is a very depressing place to be, right? And it's something that, there is a lot of loneliness in the world in that sense. And it is something that hopefully, as the world gets better, as society gets stronger, as we can care for each other better, that kind of loneliness very much can dissipate and disappear. But the loneliness that I mean in following the path of God is really kind of the moment when you're following God's path and you have to do it. alone, right? It's kind of, it's more a loneliness born out of a determination to do something, and determined to do it regardless of whether people will join you or not. So I think the good news is that this loneliness, though, is never permanent. It's always temporary, right? And that's, I think, the powerful part of following God's will, is that this loneliness is really just a temporary part of that path, right? And I think the people who we talked about, people like Noah, the providential figures of history, they knew this, and that's why they were willing to go down this path, because they were determined that no matter what happened, no matter how difficult it got, no matter if they were supported or not, they would do God's will, right? And so it's a very temporary type of loneliness. And the reason I think of Noah first when I think of this kind of topic is when I was, I think 13 or 14, I heard this lecture from Moon Impyo. I think you guys may have heard of him before. He runs kind of the Champyong and that kind of Providence. When he was younger, he was a local pastor at the church near the dormitory in Korea. And it was one of the first lectures of his. It was one of the first Korean Sunday services I fully understood. And it was under this title called, in Korean, Naman Namatnaida, right? Which means, translated literally, only I am left, right? But it has a kind of deeper meaning. And the meaning of the service, which always stuck with me, was Im Pyo-hyung was talking about Noah's story. And he was talking about Jacob and Isaac, and he was talking about Abraham, Esau, and Isaac, right? And this heart of determination to do God's will, to be willing to do it no matter what, right? And I think, and the other reason it comes to mind is that Mother has also been talking about this phrase, right? She mentions it a few times after Father passed, and this kind of determination she had to take, right? And I think for me, the way I interpret it, or maybe a better translation is, even if I am the only one left, I will still do this. I will still follow this path. I will still do God's will. And it really reminds me of something my dad said to me once. And he was talking about, sometimes there's difficulties in the church. Sometimes there's, conflicts or even corruption. But no matter what happens, he said, me and your mom, my mom at the time, that's my mom, would always try to rebuild the church. Even if we were the only ones around, if everyone else left the church, it was just us, we would still follow this path. We would still keep our faith. We would still do God's will. And that's obviously very easier said than done, right? That's a very hard thing to ask someone to do. But it made a very important impression on me, because it is kind of an important question around faith. Do we do it because we have people doing it with us? Are we kind of following along? Is it something that is there a certain amount of peer pressure, or just kind of, love for the community? Or is it something that we're fully responsible for, right? That we're fully committed to, and that we are willing to do it even without support. And I say that hoping that I'll always have support, right? Like I said in the beginning, I'm always so happy to come here and see the support, right? And see people that share a direction and a faith, because it makes it 10 times easier, right? And I really hope there's never a moment where I ever have to have no support, where I ever have to truly be the only one left, because that's the hardest path to take, right? That is really kind of the path that Father took, that all these historical figures took. but they took it to kind of make it easier for the ones after them. And I kind of very grateful for that, right? So so this point, the kind of conclusion I want to come to is that the determination and commitment, I believe, to succeed in our life of faith, to really succeed as people trying to find God and to do God's will and to understand God's will in its entirety on a kind of deepest level, is, could you do it on your own, right? Could you do it even if you were the last one left? Could you still do what God asked you to do, right? And, genuinely hoping that that's never what you need to do, but it's a good question to ask ourselves, right? Could you do it, and how would you do it if you had to do it on your own, if you had to start over from scratch, right? And even in the cases of, if you think about Jesus on the cross, right, asking, Father, why have you left me, right? Like feeling kind of completely abandoned in that moment. And also Father in Hungnam prison going, please don't worry about me. Like I can do this on my own. I can take care of myself. There's other people you should worry about. That's kind of the ultimate standard of faith, I believe, right? That's kind of the ultimate standard of taking responsibility, not just for your own life or your own circumstances, but kind of for the entire providence, for God's heart, for the restoration of humanity. And it can be a very lonely path. But again, it's only temporary. So in conclusion, I just wanted to share a quick story that happened this past week on this moment of kind of point about temporariness, because I was walking down Henry Street with a good friend named Rory. And we're coming out of a shop and a guy said, do you believe in God the Mother? And I was, the Mother.
Oh, the mother.
God the Mother. And I was like, yeah, of course. and then I kind of kept walking. Huh? Yeah. Not a picture. And then I was walking and I stopped. I'm like, Rory, we kind of have to go back and talk to this guy. So we had a 1-hour conversation, and it was just an hour. Okay, I think it was just an hour, but we'll find out in spirit world. But it was fascinating because this was a Korean. Yeah, he was a guy. But it was a Korean religion that started in 1948 that believed in two gods, actually, a male god and a female god, and that they had to be reborn as humans. So there was two Christs, a male Christ and a female Christ. Anyway, it was very fascinating. But the point we kind of got stuck on was this. No, he was Nepalese.
Oh, Nepalese.
Yeah. But the point we got stuck on was this idea of eternal hell, right? And I was like, all right, well, if God is a mother and a father, then am I gonna suffer forever in eternal torment? Will you feel bad for me, right? and he's like, yeah, we'll feel bad for you, but you'll be in heaven, you'll be fine, right? And it was kind of like this contradiction that I always like logically struggle so much with the idea of eternal hell, right? And it was just a very interesting conversation, but it kind of reinforced my faith that all suffering really has to be temporary, right? And so this whole idea of loneliness as a necessity for doing God's will is, I don't want it to be misinterpreted, right? I don't want it to be a negative thing. It really is about the heart and the determination and the commitment that we need to try to cultivate and establish in ourselves in order to be able to actually build this world where people aren't lonely, where loneliness isn't even really a word, right? Because we've kind of solved that core problem of God's heart. and connecting to God and being with God and sharing God among ourselves. So whenever I kind of talk with other religious people and we talk about heaven and hell, it always reinforces to me the thing that inspires me the most about my faith, which is the idea that no matter how long it takes, eventually God will succeed in building a kingdom of heaven on earth, right? And so all the things we try to do to get there, the different paths we take, the challenges we have, the times where we might have to be on our own or feel very down or struggle with things or really start to lose a bit of hope, they're all temporary, right? And that to me is kind of the note I want to end on, the conclusion I want to share. And with that, I would ask everyone to join me in prayer. Saramanishin Hanul Bumun. Our beloved and precious Heavenly Parent, we know that throughout history, throughout a long history, which potentially is hundreds of thousands of years of human history, you have been alone in your fight to educate and raise up fallen humanity. You have been so desperate to teach and educate all of us and all of our ancestors and all of history about the potential that we all have, that your ideal and your vision for us is so different from the world we live in. And even when we read the Bible and we read about how God was talking about destroying people, you can tell it was a story and a perspective written by fallen people, because we know that in God's heart, the thought of having to destroy people would be a very painful one, and one that would fill God with anxiety and fear and unhappiness. And ultimately, when after the flood, God promised never to do such a thing again. And I know probably one reason or motivation for that was it was too painful for him to directly cause such suffering and such kind of an act of violence or vengeance. So we are still in this day and age so far away from fully understanding the heart of our Creator, the heart of our Heavenly Parent. But we come here each Sunday to try to humble ourselves and reflect on ourselves, to see if we can grasp a little bit deeper our purpose, our potential, our meaning. If we can uncover a bit the veil that blocks us from connecting directly and fully with your heart and your wisdom. We know that it's a process that will take time. We know that it's a process that requires patience and steadfastness and commitment. So we pray today that all of us here in this room can reaffirm that we will keep pushing forward, we will keep supporting each other, we will keep living according to our consciences, because we know that our consciences will lead us back to your heart and to your will. I'm grateful for each person here today and for all our brothers and sisters throughout Ireland who were unable to make it in person, some who are able to join over Zoom. And pray that all of us can be uplifted by your love and by your words. And I report these things in all of our names here and in the name of Youngil and Vicky Lowe, the Central Family. Aju. Okay, I'll welcome Mie back up to finish off the service. Thank you, everyone.